Our last few videos on Cain course have covered the growth of European imperialism as both a reaction to nationalism and the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1800s, or as I like to call it, the quest for swag. And it's becoming very clear that if you're not European at this point, at some point, Europeans are going to show up and they're going to try to take your stuff. And really, there's only two responses you can have to that. You can let them have everything, or you can embrace imperialism yourselves and fight back. So far, in most of the places where European imperialism takes hold, those places haven't had the opportunities or the tools necessary to fight back. However, today we're going to talk about one place that does.
And that place is Japan, the group of islands that have been relatively secluded from the rest of the world up until this point in time.
To refresh your memory, Japan hasn't been all that involved on the world stage at this point. Most of that was because it was in fact a chain of islands and it was very naturally isolated from the rest of the world. The exception to that is China. For much of its history, Japan had a tributary state relationship with China, where in a lot of ways it reflected Chinese culture. Japan actually calls this selective borrowing, where it would take different elements of Chinese society and culture and take it as their own. And despite being isolated from the rest of the world, Japan actually reflects some of the same things that are going on in other parts of the world. For example, all the way up until the 1800s, Japan had an element of feudalism, just like medieval Europe had. That top-down system in which the serfs work the land and they give back to the lords who give it to the king, so on and so forth. It's true in Japan, they just have different names for everything.
The highest ruler of Japan was called the shogun, and he was a military leader who had complete and total control over all of Japan. Also had a social class similar to European knights, which were called samurai, who followed a strict moral code called bushido, or way of the warrior, and were meant to defend land on behalf of the lords, which in Japan were called daimyo.
Japanese feudalism and European feudalism were both extremely similar. The biggest difference, however, was that European feudalism ended after the Renaissance and the Crusades. Japanese feudalism continued all the way up until 1800. Again, probably a reflection of the isolation that Japan faced as a chain of islands.
Some of this isolation was also intentional by the government. The shogun was very worried about Western involvement. When he saw the events going on in China with the Opium War and how China had fallen to lucrative trade deals with the British, he was very worried about Japan being touched by the West.
But as we've been covering, there's no stopping the train that is European imperialism. Europeans have an insatiable hunger to feed the Industrial Revolution back home, and they need those raw materials. And while Japan may not have had a lot of raw materials that Europeans could have used, its location was so strategic, specifically being between the United States and China, that many wanted it. So it was only a matter of time before Japan got involved with the West. And that's where the story gets interesting. In July of 1853, a mysterious item showed up in the Bay of Japan.
Japanese citizens were shocked by what appeared to be a giant monster that had shown up in the bay, ready to attack the people of Japan.
No, not Godzilla.
What seemed to be a monster to the people of Japan was actually a U.S. steamship. But because of its seclusion, Japan had never seen a machine like this. It seemed more like a monster than an actual boat.
Imagine the shock of the people of Japan. They'd never seen anything like this, and for a ship to show up, there had to be a reason. So there were a lot of questions going on. Eventually, the inhabitants of the boat did land in Japan, and they made their intentions known fairly quickly. The leader of the ship was a guy by the name of Matthew Perry.
No, not the actor who played Chandler in Friends. Wrong Matthew Perry. Get out of here.
Come on, you guys know how I feel about that show. If you didn't know, I think it's extremely overrated and not funny. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Anyways, the real Matthew Perry had been sent to Japan by President Teddy Roosevelt from the United States with the intent to open up trade with Japan. And initially, Japan's response was no.
But Japan quickly realized that the United States had the naval capabilities to completely destroy the nation. Plus, now that the citizens of Japan had seen the military and industrial might of the United States, many of them wanted in.
So eventually, Japan did relent to the United States' request and became a favored nation in regards to trading with the United States. Soon after, other Western nations began to pursue the same type of ordeal. In the process, Japan continued to get the raw end of different trade deals. Many people in Japan, this was extremely humiliating. And it truly reflects the continued processes of imperialism that we continue to see throughout this time period. The daimyo, the samurai, the people of Japan were all upset with the way things were going. And this all starts to change in about 1857 when a 15-year-old emperor takes the throne. This emperor, who is often known as the Meiji Emperor, Meiji means enlightened rule, was dedicated to bringing Japan to the same status of some of these Western imperial powers. Never again would Japan be treated the way it had been. And so he begins to make some subtle changes, like moving the capital to a city that is now known as Tokyo. But through all of the humiliation from the West, specifically the United States, Japan had received the blueprint for how to be a true imperial world power. And that's where this Meiji Restoration, as it is known, begins to take off.
The first step of this was restarting the Japanese government. Japan looked to Germany for the model of success, embracing unification and nationalist styles.
Again, nationalism holds that the interests of your countries are of utmost importance and should be pursued above all else. And the second part of the German plan towards unification and world power growth, if you remember, was iron or industrialism, and that's what Japan does next.
The Japanese government began building large factories and selling them to wealthy families, which were called zaibatsu. Japanese family names from brands that you might recognize today, like Mitsubishi and Kawasaki, both became very powerful and prominent within Japanese.
Within less than 50 years, Japan had suddenly become an industrial leader worldwide because of the aggressive nationalist pursuit and the desire never to be trampled over again. Yet Japan had one problem. While it had the factories it needed to be successful, it didn't have the resources to actually fund them. Because of that, Japan turns to the same reason why the United States was there in the first place: imperialism. Through imperialism, Japan could expand to the height that it wanted to and receive all of the resources it needed to fuel its massive new factories.
Japan's modernization gave it an advantage over China, and it began to take territory from that country. Very quickly, Japan's emblem of the rising sun became a symbol of power throughout East Asia.
Alarms are going. Now, if all of a sudden alarms are going off in your head with something about World War II, you're right, we're going to get there. Japan's conquest of territories in the Pacific and territories in China didn't really give it the world status it had wanted. In order to strike back against Western imperialism and prove that Japan was a world power, it needed to attack a Western country. The target is Russia. Now, you know me, I'm a sports guy. I like to put things in sports perspectives. To put this in a basketball perspective, Russia is Shaquille O'Neal, Japan is me. As you know, Shaq is huge, almost 7 feet tall and one of the biggest players to ever play in the NBA. I'm a 5'10" teacher. Who do you think is going to win that game? My point exactly. Russia should wipe the floor with Japan, but that's not what happens.
Russia actually was a little bit of an easy target for Japan because it had not modernized in the same way Japan had. Russia had not yet embraced the Industrial Revolution. But Japan's industrialization and growth, specifically of a modern navy, allowed it to wipe the floor with Russia fairly significantly. This not only obviously humiliated Russia yet again, it also showed that Japan was in fact a world power.
It's an extremely unlikely story, yet it happens. It's just as unlikely as me beating Shaq in a game of one-on-one. But it's not just that Japan beat Russia, it's that Japan utterly humiliates Russia. That's the equivalent of me dunking on Shaq. Because last I checked, not only am I 5'10" and Shaq is almost 7 feet, I can't dunk. It would be completely unexpected and almost impossible for me all of a sudden to two-hand throw down over Shaquille O'Neal. Just like it would be almost impossible for Japan in the span of 50 years to not only modernize, westernize, and industrialize to beat one of the predominant European powers of that time. Yet that's what happens. And it shows just how powerful a country can become when it embraces industrialism, nationalism, and imperialism. In a lot of ways, the ultimate trifecta of power in the 1800s. Japan does that in just 50 years. It is now suddenly a world power and a threat to much of the world, just like Germany was in Europe. And now Japan is something that everyone else has to pay attention to. No longer is Japan getting walked over in trade deals. It's the one making trade deals. And for world history, this is a signal of something far greater that is about to come. But again, that's a story for another day. In the meantime, we can learn about the perils of nationalism, imperialism, and industrialism and what happens when you combine all three. It makes a threat to stability. It makes a threat to peace. And yet, in so many ways, we shouldn't single out Japan for its rapid militaristic growth and its rapid use of imperialism. Because this is the same exact thing that Europeans have been doing for almost 100 years. So can we really criticize Japan for following a greater world trend? And can we really criticize them for protecting their own interests and making their country strong? That's a bigger question, and that's really a question that goes back to what you think about nationalism and what you think about imperialism. It's a worldview question, and one that, once again, you have to answer on your own. It truly is an underdog story, but never again will Japan be considered an underdog, as we will see that continue to unfold throughout the rest of world history. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.